Vampires and werewolves, castles, and coffins. These are just a few of the things that you can expect in a classic Hammer horror film. I absolutely love Hammer horror films. The classics starring Christopher Lee, Peter Cushing, and a whole lot else that primarily came out in the 50s, 60s, and 70s. And today I'm going to be telling you about my top 10 Hammer films of all time. But really just from those 3 decades. What's going on, everyone? Welcome to the Cobwebs channel, where we are dusting off old movies. My name is Daniel, and yeah, today I'm going to be telling you about my very favorite Hammer horror films of all time. If you didn't know, Hammer films are some of my favorite movies in all of film history, and they're probably my favorite kind of horror movie. I got really obsessed with them a few years ago, even though I grew up with 3 in particular. There were 3 that I taped off of TV, and I'm going to talk about all of them today, when I was a kid. Taped them onto a VHS tape, watched them over and over again. Then it was a few years ago as an adult where I was like, are there more of these movies and can I get my hands on them? And in the years since, more and more have been released on Blu-ray in the US. They've become more accessible than ever, and I've definitely seen their popularity growing, which has been wonderful to see. And yeah, these are my 10 favorites. So without further ado, let's kick off with number 10. I love so many Hammer movies. There are so many movies I love that are not going to make this list. So it was really hard to pick a 10. You know, just picking one from this whole big batch, but I'm going to go with The Phantom of the Opera from 1962. This is Hammer's only attempt at the Phantom of the Opera story, and I know it's a little bit weird, but this is my personal favorite version of that story. I'm a fan of the Lon Chaney version, a little bit less of the Claude Rains version, and there's some other good ones out there, but this one happens to be my favorite. A corrupt lord steals the life's work of a poor composer. In an attempt to stop the printing of the music with the lord's name on it, the composer breaks into the printing office and accidentally starts a fire, leaving him severely disfigured. Years later, he returns to terrorize a London opera house that is about to perform one of his stolen operas. One of the best things about Hammer movies is they have so many regular actors, so I'll tell you about all of those with each movie. The regular actors for this one is really just Michael Gough. Yes, Alfred from the classic Batman movies. Herbert Lom plays the Phantom in this movie, and there are a few interesting things I feel I have to say about him. First of all, his mask is very unique. It's entirely white, and it covers his entire face, and it's very eerie. It's one of my favorite Phantom of the Opera masks of all time. And just the look of the Phantom does a lot for me in this movie. But also, this version of the story takes away the romantic element. The Phantom is not actually in love with Christine. He really is just trying to get revenge for the stealing of his music, and he believes Christine is the best person to sing his music. So he does act as her angel of music, as in classic versions of this story, and teaching her how to perform his music the best, but the music is the extent of it. And this makes him a far more sympathetic Phantom than we're used to, where the Lon Chaney version is much more of a monster. This is a very sympathetic man who Christine and her love interest, Mr. Hunter, end up helping out quite a bit through the movie. And I really love this film. It's a little bit lower on violence and exploitation elements than some other Hammer films, but it's a beautiful, classy film with a great villain turn by Michael Gough. Also, fun fact about this movie is Cary Grant almost starred in the film. Now, while Hammer made a couple of different attempts at the Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde story, my number 9 is my favorite, and that is Dr. Jekyll and Sister Hyde from 1971. Hammer definitely got further down the exploitation path in the 70s, and this movie is a prime example of that. In Victorian London, Dr. Henry Jekyll attempts to create an elixir of life using female hormones stolen from fresh corpses. He reasons that these hormones will wipe out all common diseases and extend his life. However, once Dr. Jekyll drinks the serum himself, he transforms into a beautiful but evil woman. He soon needs female hormones for his serum to maintain, so a number of London women meet bloody deaths. Hammer regulars in this film, only Ralph Bates as Dr. Jekyll. A really cool thing about this movie is it's actually multiple classic horror stories put into one. It is a Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde story, but it's also a body snatcher story, like the Robert Louis Stevenson story that Val Lewton made a movie about with Boris Karloff, and it's a Jack the Ripper movie. And I'm kind of fascinated by Jack the Ripper movies. It's a weird little subgenre of classic, or really gothic horror, you might say. And this is my personal favorite Jack the Ripper movie, even though it's not technically a Jack the Ripper film. But when Ralph Bates is stalking the streets of foggy, extremely atmospheric London in the classic Jack the Ripper costume and killing women as Jack the Ripper did, It's so atmospheric and scary and creepy. This is my favorite Ralph Bates performance in a Hammer film. But then Martine Beswick actually plays Sister Hyde, and they're both phenomenal at playing the same character but different sides of. It's just such an entertaining, classic gothic horror film, and I enjoy it so much. At number 8, I am sad to say, is Hammer's only attempt at a werewolf story, and that is The Curse of the Werewolf from 1960. In 18th century Spain, an adopted boy learns he has been cursed from birth to become a werewolf, and when he grows up, he terrorizes the inhabitants of his town unless his soul can be saved by love. Hammer regulars in this film: Oliver Reed and Yvonne Romaine. So this movie is based on the novel The Werewolf of Paris, and unlike Hammer's adaptations of Frankenstein and Dracula, based on novels, but in which Hammer did a great job condensing the story into a very tight, smaller version, this is a sprawling epic, even though it's only at 90 minutes, because this movie starts well before the birth of our lead character, played by Oliver Reed, the birth of our werewolf, and it tells the backstory of how he was conceived, how he grew up, and there's so much backstory to this movie that takes up the entire first half of the film before Oliver Reed even comes on screen. And I know that sounds like a huge detriment, that sounds like an insult to the movie, but I think it works because the movie is always very interesting, very entertaining, and always looks incredible. It's this gorgeous film. Hammer was actually going to make a different movie with these sets, a much more prestigious movie that never ended up happening. They reused all the sets for this film, so it looks way better than it probably would have if it wasn't for that. Oliver Reed gives a sweaty but iconic performance as this lead character and as this werewolf, and I love the look of the werewolf in this film because you can see Oliver Reed, the actor, in the monster, probably better than any other werewolf I've ever seen in a movie, except maybe Jack Nicholson in Wolf, but that barely counts. He's great in the film, and he was actually asked late in his career what film he thought he would be remembered for, and he said this: the movie has an incredible third act with great werewolf action, with incredible stunt work. I know it takes a long time to get there, but it is worth the wait. And the wait's pretty good anyway. At number 7 is the first appearance of my favorite Hammer franchise, and that is The Brides of Dracula from 1960. The first sequel to Hammer's Dracula movie, after the events of the original film, vampire hunter Van Helsing returns to Transylvania to destroy handsome bloodsucker Baron Meinster, who has designs on the beautiful young schoolteacher Mary Ann. Hammer regulars include Peter Cushing and, in a small role, Michael Ripper. A really interesting thing about this movie is this is the only Hammer Dracula movie that does not actually have Dracula, and in that way it's kind of the Halloween 3 or Friday the 13th 5 of its franchise. They took an interesting direction with this film. They, instead of following the character of Dracula to the next movie, as most horror franchises would do, it follows the character of Van Helsing. This is a new Van Helsing story, Peter Cushing's character from the first Dracula film. And as a Peter Cushing, Van Helsing vampire adventure film, it's phenomenal. I don't miss Christopher Lee's Dracula at all as much as I love him, because I love seeing Peter Cushing off on this different adventure. We've got David Peel as the vampire in this, and while he's certainly no Christopher Lee, he doesn't compare. I've definitely grown to appreciate his posh and sophisticated air that he brings to this very classy vampire. It's a completely different kind of vampire that Christopher Lee brought to that first movie, and I really appreciate that as, just a counterpoint. But while he might disappoint a bit, the vampire brides, the brides of Dracula that we get in this movie, are very creepy. They're incredible. They're great villains. And there's this amazing sequence in the movie I'll never forget where one of them is rising out of her coffin that's buried in the ground, so the dirt's coming up. And it's just one of the most perfectly gothic images I've ever seen in a gothic horror film. Pretty much all of these movies are beautiful, but this is one of the most beautiful Hammer films when it comes to sets and costumes. And as just an action hero, vampire hunter, Peter Cushing Van Helsing movie, it couldn't be better. I think it's so good. At number 6 is my favorite of Hammer's trashy 1970s period, and that is Twins of Evil from 1971. A religious sect led by the sinister Gustav Well hunts all women suspected of witchcraft and kills a number of innocent victims. His nieces, 2 twins, come to live with them after their parents' death, and one of them involves herself in a devilish vampire cult and becomes an instrument of justice office in the town of Karnstein. Hammer regulars, Peter Cushing. So this pick is not quite just Twins of Evil, it's also representative of the whole Karnstein trilogy. Hammer did a whole trilogy of sleazy vampire movies in the early 1970s. The Vampire Lovers, Lust of the Vampire, and then Twins of Evil. As you can tell, Twins of Evil is my favorite of the bunch, and I always describe this as a kitchen sink movie. It throws so much stuff all into one film because it is a vampire movie, it's a witchcraft movie, a witch hunter movie, satanic cult movie. It has so many different, really folk horror aspects, folk horror subgenres, and it throws them all into one little vampire movie. And I think it's just a complete blast from start to finish. Very over the top, more over the top than most Hammer movies, I would say, with a great high-pitched villain performance from Peter Cushing. He's so good in this movie. Before we get into the top 5 real quick, just wanted to say if you're enjoying this video, please consider giving a like to the video because it really does help. It tells YouTube that my videos are worth recommending, so it helps grow the channel. And if you want to see more top 10 lists about classic movies, old movies, I'm right now trying to create a catalog of them, and you can hit that subscribe button. We'll have a lot more videos about old movies on the way. But without further ado, let's talk about my top 5 Hammer movies. And my number 5 is The Plague of the Zombies from 1966. Now this one tells the story of Sir James and his daughter Sylvia, who have come into a small Cornish village to visit and possibly help one of James's old medical students and his wife, a friend of Sylvia's. There they find that several of the townspeople are dying of an unknown sickness, and a mysterious squire may be behind it all. Sir James, Sylvia, and the town doctor fight voodoo and undead zombies. Hammer regulars include Michael Ripper and Andre Morale. Now this is Hammer's only zombie movie, and I think they knocked it out of the park. Something that's so important to note about it is that it came out 2 years before George Romero's Night of the Living Dead. And I'm not going to take anything away from Night of the Living Dead. It is a groundbreaking film. It did create the zombie genre as we know it today, but this movie has so much about what we consider to be zombie movies now, and it did it first. It does have voodoo zombies. Voodoo zombies were the concept of what zombies were before George Romero changed everything. But there's also this incredible sequence of zombies bursting out of their grave. One of the coolest gothic horror sequences I've ever seen. And you can draw a straight line from that sequence to Night of the Living Dead. So this movie does not get enough historical credit, near as much as I think it should. And it's a great Hammer movie. It's incredibly fun, very tightly paced, and I highly recommend it if you haven't seen it yet, especially if you love Romero's Dead trilogy. My number 4 is my favorite Hammer movie that doesn't fit into any franchise, and that is The Gorgon from 1965. In early 20th century Middle Europe, villagers are being terrorized and turned to stone by a Medusa creature known as the Gorgon. When this fate befalls a visitor, experts from a university arrive to try and get to the bottom of it all. Hammer regulars include Peter Cushing, Christopher Lee, and Barbara Shelley. The Gorgon is a rare thing. It is a horror film starring the monster of a Medusa creature. So for one thing, it's one of Hammer's examples of a female monster, which is cool to see for something different. But then also, I just love how unique it is. What a unique monster that you hardly ever get to see. Like I've said about many of these movies, it's a gorgeous film. It has incredible gothic atmosphere, but I also feel like it's very much of a dark fairy tale. Terrence Fisher, his heart was really with fairy tales. He was the director of this movie, the director of so many classic Hammer films. I just feel Terrence Fisher's heart in this movie. He was a very sentimental guy who loved fairy tales, and this movie feels like a precursor to Guillermo del Toro's career. I feel a lot of Crimson Peak, a lot of Pan's Labyrinth in this movie. If you love del Toro, I think you gotta see The Gorgon. But like I said, when I listed off the Hammer regulars, it's got one of the most iconic casts of a Hammer film. Christopher Lee and Peter Cushing are great. I love their facial hair, epic facial hair in this movie. But Barbara Shelley steals the show for me. She's incredible in this movie. The only thing that's really wrong with this movie is the Gorgon does look fake, and the snakes on her hair don't look real. Christopher Lee famously said that the only thing wrong with the Gorgon is the Gorgon, and that's kind of true, but as a fan of practical effects, sometimes I don't care if they look fake. I find the effect very charming when it's a physical thing in front of the screen and it's not CGI. I would rather look at this fake-looking Medusa than a CGI version, personally. So that's not too much of a downside to me, but just something that I do feel I have to note. But the Gorgon is a beautiful, atmospheric, gothic romance, gothic fairy tale, maybe even more than a pure popular horror film. My 2 and 3 I constantly flip-flop, so I could wake up tomorrow and wish I had done it the opposite way, but I'm sticking to it. This is set in stone right here. So my number 3 is Dracula Has Risen from the Grave from 1968. When Castle Dracula is exorcised by the Monsignor, it accidentally brings the Count back from the dead. Dracula follows the Monsignor back to his hometown, preying on the holy man's beautiful niece, her fiancé, and their friends. Hammer regulars include Christopher Lee, Michael Ripper, and Veronica Carlson. Like I noted before, Dracula, it's my favorite franchise in Hammer. It's one of my favorite franchises in horror films, period. And this movie, I love it so much. It's my favorite underrated Hammer film, I feel, because a lot of people think it's just okay. And I think my love for it is a bit unusual, so take that with a grain of salt. But I not only do I love gothic horror films, I love slasher films. And I feel like this is a gothic slasher movie. It's where the franchise really pivots to becoming much like an 80s slasher franchise, where it becomes about a group of young people who have their romances and their relationships, and they like to have fun and they like to drink. But then Dracula comes in and starts picking them off one by one. I do love the structure of a slasher franchise. I find it fun, very comforting, and that's very much what this movie is. But it's also directed by Freddie Francis. And Freddie Francis was an incredible cinematographer. He shot movies like The Innocents and Glory with Denzel Washington. And he directed quite a bit of horror films in the 60s and 70s. And this is such a beautiful movie, not just because of sets and costumes, like I've said many times before, but the lighting. There are sequences in which Dracula is coming in to bite his victims through the window, like vampires, classic vampires often do. And it's lit with so many pinks and purples. It almost looks like a precursor to Argento's Suspiria. I know that's a little bit hyperbole. I'm just saying, like, maybe a bit of a precursor to that. And it's such a beautifully lit movie. There's sequences where Dracula's chasing people on rooftops through this village that are so gorgeously shot. It's a movie that I love to look at, but I love the characters. Probably my favorite group of victims in a Dracula film. Barry Andrews and Veronica Carlson play the two young lovers. And the young lovers in gothic horror films are often some of the more boring characters, but they are so much fun to watch. I love their relationship. There's an interesting thing where Paul, who's Barry Andrews, he is an atheist and he has to come to terms with, how do I fight a vampire who's against crosses and holy water and stuff like that when I'm an atheist? It's a really interesting story there. Such a good classic vampire movie. And my number 2 is what I'm saying now, my favorite movie from my favorite Hammer franchise, and that is Horror of Dracula from 1958. Jonathan Harker takes a job as a librarian at the castle of Count Dracula. When he reveals himself to be an undercover vampire hunter and puts Dracula's bride to eternal rest, Dracula vows revenge against Harker's loved ones and his friend, Professor Van Helsing. Hammer regulars include Peter Cushing, Christopher Lee, and Michael Goff. This is Hammer's first Dracula movie and their first gigantic hit. This was right after they decided to reboot the classic Frankenstein story the year prior, and then they went to Dracula, and this movie was just such a smash hit. It's even probably even less faithful to the novel than the Bela Lugosi version is, but I am just so amazed at how it takes the structure of the classic Dracula story and boils it down to the bare essentials and creates this incredibly tight, effective, quickly paced story that just kind of rocks from start to finish. This is, of course, Christopher Lee's first turn as Dracula, his most iconic character that he would ever play in his career, and he's amazing in this movie. Lee has 16 lines of dialogue that are all given by the 10-minute mark, but he doesn't even need dialogue. He is so incredible as this feral monster, this red-eyed, fanged beast with blood pouring down his face. And this was a revolutionary thing at the time, because if you look at the Bela Lugosi Dracula film, I love it, but you never see his teeth, you never see blood, you never actually see him bite anybody. And this movie goes all the way with teeth and blood, and even a very sexual way that he bites a woman at one point. It's kind of a provocative movie for the late 1950s. Peter Cushing is, of course, incredible as Professor Van Helsing. It's fast-paced, it's got an action-packed finale, it's got one of the greatest scores in the entire horror genre. Horror of Dracula is a classic for a reason. But my number 1 is clear. It has always been my favorite Hammer movie. I'm sure it always will be. And that is Curse of Frankenstein from 1957. While awaiting execution for murder, Baron Victor Frankenstein tells the story of a creature he built and brought to life. Hammer regulars include Peter Cushing, and Christopher Lee. You know what this is. It's the classic Frankenstein tale. In 1957, Hammer decided to reboot the classic Frankenstein movie franchise that had become so popular because of Boris Karloff and James Whale in the 1930s. And they weren't allowed to use anything that Universal had done back in that time because of copyright. They could adapt the Mary Shelley book, but they couldn't do anything from Universal. And this really forced them to be incredibly unique, to go a dramatically different path than Universal had. So while that movie is very much about the monster, and it pretty much skips how Frankenstein actually creates this thing, this movie is so much about the process. It is about the slow, grueling process of how does this guy, Baron Victor von Frankenstein, actually build this monster. Peter Cushing plays the doctor. He is the greatest Dr. Frankenstein in cinema history. I'm sorry, but there's no debate. It's such a unique take on the character because this Dr. Frankenstein is evil. He's very much the villain of the story, a villainous character. And the creature that he builds is much less of a character than Boris Karloff had. Christopher Lee as the creature is very much like a wounded animal. This just poor, sad thing that never should have been brought to life, that this evil doctor created and won't let go. And the movie is about the violence that comes from that. It is my favorite version of the Frankenstein story. Dramatically different than the book, dramatically different from the original version from James Whale. But it's my personal favorite because I think Peter Cushing is so good. I am fascinated by the sadness of Christopher Lee's creature. And again, like pretty much all these movies, it's a gorgeous film. And it's one of my favorite horror films of all time. And definitely my favorite Hammer movie. So that's it, folks. My top 10 Hammer horror films. Hope you enjoyed this video, but more than anything, I just want to know what your top 10 Hammer films are. So leave it down in the comments below. Let me know what your favorites are and what you thought of this list. Once again, give a like if you enjoyed this video and a subscribe if you want to see more like this. Thank you very much. We'll talk about more old movies next time.